Hello my friends and welcome to my new video. In the last video I built this tiny World War I trench diorama scene, and today's video will all about how to paint these little guys, the German World War I soldiers in 1:35 scale. In particular I will talk about how to paint the uniforms and the equipment, and I will talk about the whole painting process in great detail, so let's start right into it. Yes, you heard me right my friends. Now I will show you step by step how I paint German soldiers of the First World War. But before I go into exact painting steps, I would like to briefly explain the idea behind my painting style. My way of painting figures aims for high contrasts. I think that simply makes the figures look better. The high contrasts make it easier to recognize the details, such as facial features and expressions, but also small parts of the uniform, and not only under perfect lighting conditions with a macro camera and YouTube videos, but also from a normal viewing distance. At the same time, I try to maintain a realistic look and achieve good color transitions. The first and most boring step is priming the figures. I use the Amomig one-shot primer in black for this. Nevertheless, there's something satisfying about this step because it allows all parts of the figure to blend into a uniform surface. In addition, the black primer not only ensures that the paint adheres better to the plastic, but also serves as a base for the shadows. They serve as a contrast to the highlights, which are then sprayed on from above with deck tan. This is the preparatory work for one of the most popular techniques in figure painting today, glazing, which has become particularly well known through Uncle Nightshift. This involves shading in advance with an airbrush and then coloring the black and white pre-shaded surface with thin layers of paint, known as glazes, without covering the pre-shaded surface. But don't worry, this video will not also go into this technique in detail. Although I'm going to use glazes to apply the base color, I only use them to make it easier to identify the right places for highlights and shadows when painting with a brush. I would first like to show you how I paint field grey. This color can be used for jackets and trousers, depending on what depiction you are aiming for, but in any case the field jackets are always field grey. I tested 3 different base colors for field grey in advance. One from Vallejo from a set for painting field grey for the Second World War, one from ICM and one from AK Interactive from the previously mentioned painting set. After testing, only the field grey from ICM convinced me. As you can see here in the comparison with a replica jacket, it comes closest to the original color. The other colors were either too green and light or had a turquoise blue cast. And that's why I opted for the base color from ICM. For the Reseda green collar, which you can also see here on the replica, I opted for the color from AK Interactive as it was a good match. Next it was time to apply the base color. I heavily thinned the ICM paint and applied it in several thin glazes. To speed up the drying process, I used a hairdryer on a cold setting. It's important to never use hot air, as this can irreparably damage the figure. After 3 to 4 glazes, I was satisfied with the paint application and started with the highlights. For the first highlights, I mixed sunny skin tone with ICM's field grey and applied this mixture to the areas that would be hit by the light, such as the tops of edges, the back and folds. This color application is the most extensive, so it is not yet so crucial that you have to be particularly precise. I would like to emphasize that the painting process in reality is not as linear as in my videos. I often repeat working steps, like here with the color application, to intensify certain areas. It's a question of personal taste how often and how intensively you repeat individual steps to achieve the desired result. A single step is rarely final, but part of an iterative process. I then mixed a second, even lighter highlight with sunny skin tone. I made sure that this color was even lighter and more diluted than the first highlight. This mixture was then applied to the same areas as the first highlight, but in a smaller area to emphasize the highlights even more. In this step, the highlights are still very subtle, so I move on to the third highlights. I dilute almost pure sunny skin tone, possibly with a minimal amount of field grey, extremely heavily and apply it in the same places but even more precisely. I make sure to apply the color very thinly and work in several layers to build up the highlights slowly. Because the color is so diluted, I can use sunny skin tone almost pure without changing the green base color. The thin layers of color only provide a targeted brightening effect. Now I turn my attention to the shadows. To do this, I mix field grey with black and dilute the paint considerably. I used this heavily diluted color to intensify the shadows on the folds, especially on the undersides of the arms. I also paint in additional folds to emphasize the depth and darken specific areas that are in the shadows and need to be darker. Because the color is so thin, smooth transitions are created directly. In the next step, I applied the second shading layer. This consists of a large proportion of black and a small proportion of field gray. I used this to create the deepest shadows. I outlined details and edges, such as around the Sappen armor, and painted very intense shadows. The strong effect is intentional, as it will be softened later to create a striking color contrast. I also use fine lines to recreate the texture of the fabric and create a certain materiality. After completing the shading work, I moved on to creating the fourth highlights. These highlights should also be very high contrast and bright as a counterpart to the very high contrast shadows. Instead of sunny skin tone, I used a mixture of field grey and light flesh, which I applied in fine strokes to the highest areas. The effect is deliberately too strong again, as it will be toned down in the next steps. The aim is to achieve a high contrast and emphasize the texture of the fabric. After softening the strong contrast with a glaze of the base color field grey and blending the two colors together, I used pure light flesh to highlight the seam line on the back and edges such as on the sleeves. After completing this step, I applied the concept I call meta highlights. This is not a novel concept, but a method of subtly brightening wider areas of the figure, similar to color modulation on armor models. The aim is to achieve a more nuanced and realistic lighting effect. In particular, the top of the back and the shoulders should be lightened with the softest possible transitions. To do this, I mixed a highly diluted color mixture of sunny skin tone and a touch of field grey. I applied this mixture mainly to the shoulders, using the brush to push the color upwards from the middle back to the shoulders. As most of the color is concentrated at the end of the brush stroke, this achieved a targeted brightening of the shoulders. The strong thinning of the color immediately created very soft transitions. The final step was to apply so-called meta shadows. This is analogous to the meta highlights, except that wider areas of the figure are darkened. I mixed the shading color of black and field grey, thinned it down a lot and pushed it down from the middle back to darken the whole area. For the uniform below the belt, I shaded towards the belt line and lightened towards the bottom of the uniform to achieve the desired effect. Then were the stone grey pants on the plan. As I'm not introducing any new or particularly innovative techniques in this section, I'll keep this part of the video short. First I used dark sea green from Vallejo as the base color and painted the trousers opaque with it. For the highlights I mixed blue-grey pale with dark sea green and applied this mixture generously to the areas I wanted to lighten, such as the tops of edges and the top of the pants. I also kept the highlights rather subtle and applied them over a larger area. Once I had applied the highlights to the edges, I moved on to mixing a shading color. I used dark sea green again and darkened it with black. I then applied this mixture in the shadow areas, such as underneath folds, in creases and cracks. I then used almost pure black to increase the contrast and put the deepest shadows in the crevices. As I was a bit sloppy there, I then restored the highlights. Next I used almost pure blue-grey pale and then also deck tan to paint the strongest highlights. At the same time I tried to use very fine brush strokes to mimic the texture of the rough wool fabric of the pants. You can argue about the degree of realism, but for me this variance on the pants and fabric looks much more appealing than just softly blended uniform colors. The previously created high contrast was softened again by glazing the base color in order to combine the shades, textures and highlights more realistically. Once I had highlighted the texture again in certain places, the painting of the stone grey trousers was complete. In the next step I turned my attention to painting the red piping on the trousers. First I mixed a shadow color for the red stripes of the piping using black, red and black. I used this to trace the lines of the piping. In the next step I applied bloody red, taking care to place it in the middle of the previous stripe so that the darker color remains visible on the outer sides. In the third step, I mixed a highlight color of light flesh and bloody red and applied it to the center of the strip and to the lightest areas such as the tops of the pleats of the piping to create a three-dimensional effect. To further enhance this effect, I outlined the piping with the shadow color at the end to emphasize the contrast and three-dimensionality. Next, I turned my attention to painting the Sappenpanzer. In contrast to the uniform and trousers, where textures are emphasized, softer transitions are necessary here to realistically depict the metallic steel plate. For this reason, I changed my approach slightly. In the first step, I applied basalt gray from Vallejo as an opaque base color, as I found this shade particularly suitable for the steel plate of the armor. I then mixed the highlight color from blue-gray pale and basalt gray. I diluted this color very much and applied it to the upper areas of the armor. To achieve smooth transitions and a soft brightening from the start, I pushed the color upwards from the center of the armor. As with the uniform, most of the color sticks where the brush is lifted. By applying several thin layers, I built up the brightness towards the top, creating soft transitions at the same time. I applied the same process to the individual panel segments, building up the brightness of the individual plates towards the outside. In the next step, I mixed the shadow color by combining black with the base color and diluting it heavily. I then applied this mixture from the center of the armor downwards, or, in the case of the individual plate segments, from the outside inwards to shade the lower parts of the armor and create a three-dimensional effect. I repeated these steps several times, adjusting the color mixtures each time. Finally, I applied a very thin layer of unmixed blue-gray pale to the lightest areas. The gray tones became darker and darker towards the lower areas, enhancing the three-dimensional effect. Once this basic work was complete, I painted the details of the armor. I used deck 10 to emphasize the individual rivets and highlight the edges of the armor. I then turned my attention to painting the gas mask can. As gas mask cans were often kept in field grey, I used the same base color as for the uniform. I darkened the rear area of the can with the shadow color, while I lightened the front area on the top with highlight colors. I used very thin colors to create smooth transitions and emphasize the round shapes of the can. Finally, I emphasized the edges with a mixture of field grey and deck tan and highlighted the details that I had previously outlined with the shadow color to achieve a high contrast. This completed the gas mask can, as I didn't want to spend too much extra time on it. To give the armor additional character, I then decided to add signs of wear. First I dabbed on some chips with a sponge and then intensified them with a brush. I then painted undiluted dark grey shadow paint into these chips to create the impression of three-dimensional chips and scratches. As this effect was too intense at first, I softened it with a glaze of basalt grey over the entire armor. As a result, I achieved a balanced appearance for my taste. Afterwards, I realized that I had forgotten to paint the reseda green collar. To make up for this, I used dark green grey as the base color and added the highlights and shading with corresponding lighter and darker tones. Next, it was time to paint the leather parts of the figure, especially the knee reinforcements. I used leather brown from Vallejo as the base color. For the highlights, I added new Iraqi army sand and applied this mixture to the top of the knee and the center of the leather patch to create a three-dimensional effect. I left the edges dark. Using brush strokes, I tried to create a leather-like texture, especially on folds and bumps. In general, I made sure to lighten the center and top of the leather patch and keep the underside darker, highlighting the edges later. To further increase the plasticity, I mixed the shading color of leather brown and black and used it to shade the lower parts of the leather patch and around the edges. The next step involved painting the puttees. First, I applied old wood as a base color over a large area. I used new Iraqi army sand to emphasize the individual stripes of the puttees. As the highlighting effect was low, I outlined the crevices with leather brown and a shading color of leather brown and black with a fine brush tip. To increase the contrast, I applied irregular highlights with deck 10 to create the impression of bulges. I did this step twice in total, as I realized that the contrast wasn't strong enough in the first pass. In the second pass, I made the hollows and cracks much stronger and more visible and painted them thicker and wider. I then emphasized the highlights with deck 10 again. After applying a thin glaze of the base color to blend everything better, I used a thin shading color of leather brown and black to apply several glazes to the lower ends of the puttees. This served two purposes. On the one hand, it creates the impression of mud and dirt. On the other hand, it increases the plasticity through color modulation. The darker lower area and the lighter upper area create an appealing 3D effect. At the same time, this serves as the first weathering effect to dirty the puttees. Next, I turned my attention to painting the black leather shoes. This technique can also be used for belts and other black leather parts, as many leather parts were dyed black after the black dye order. I started by painting the shoes black. I used diluted dark sea green for the first large highlights. I then painted stronger highlights with mixtures of blue-gray pale diluted to varying degrees and set specific points of light. I used undiluted blue-gray pale for specific highlights and to emphasize edges and details. By applying several layers of diluted color, I was able to achieve larger highlighted areas. The specific highlights are almost similar to non-metallic metal techniques, but I finished by toning down the lightened areas and highlights with glazes of black to achieve a coherent overall look. To further refine the color variation, I applied a glaze of leather brown. This was intended to subtly emphasize the original character of the leather, which was brown before blackening. As the leather parts were often blackened by the soldiers themselves, the coloring was often uneven. By glazing, I increased the color variation and gave the leather a warmer and more appealing look. Then it was time to paint the grenades. The blasting caps were painted in a similar way to the gas mask can. I used field grey as the base color and created shading and highlights with the same colors for the uniform. The edges and details were emphasized with deck tan. Using a fine brush tip and white paint, I tried to imitate the lettering on the blasting cap, which creates an additional level of detail. The stems of the shells were particularly interesting to paint. First, I applied old wood as base color and tried to show the wood texture with deck tan and fine brush strokes. I then applied wood grain from Vallejo as the glaze to create a red-brown wood tone. The fine brush strokes and thin glaze created a realistic wood texture. To increase the color variation, I applied the shading color of leather brown and black to the bottom of the handle and blended it with the dark glaze. This created a gradient from dark to light that increased the plasticity and color variation. As so often before, I tried to design every single detail in terms of color modulation in order to achieve an appealing result. Then I turned to painting the breadback, a true feast of textures. First I applied old wood as the base color. Then, using a mixture of leather brown and black, and in the following step with wood grain, I applied the line and texture by painting fine, crisscrossing strokes. I concentrated these strokes in the deeper areas and creases to create shadows at the same time. For the highlights I used new Iraqi army sand and deck tan, also painting this cross texture. I concentrated the strokes on the most raised areas. I worked particularly finely with deck tan as this was the final texture layer. Details and shading were outlined with a mixture of leather brown and black. Glazes of leather brown and wood grain enhanced the depth and transitions. The stitching and other details were outlined with fine dots of deck tan on a dark background, as were the buttons, rivets and edges. I then painted the canteen. First I applied leather brown as the base color. Then I dabbed on fine dots of color with light earth to imitate the felt texture of the bottle. I concentrated on the top to make it lighter. For the darker areas I mixed the shading color of leather brown and black and dabbed on dark dots, especially on the underside. Several glazes of leather brown were used to blend the colors and deepen the felt texture. I repeated these steps several times to enhance the texture and emphasize the contrast between the light top and dark bottom. Next I painted the details of the canteen. The seam on the side was emphasized with deck tan and black shading. To paint the lid of the canteen, I used a simplified non-metallic metal technique. First I painted the lid with dark sea green as the base color. I then applied and blended blue-gray pale for the highlights. A very bright and specific highlight was added on top to create the impression of a strong light reflection, giving the lid a metallic look. The figure was now almost completely painted. Finally I painted the remaining details, such as the trench knife. As I didn't use any new techniques, I used the same colors as for painting the shoes, as this is also a black leather part. For the handle I used the same colors as for the grenade handles and the same procedure. For the scabbard of the trench knife, I made sure to choose a specific side for the light reflection, namely the back side facing away from the body. I lightened the side more to create the impression of increased light reflection. After these final details, the figure was finished. The only things missing are the heads with the helmets and the skin tones. Although I show the painting of the helmets in this video, I will not focus on the skin tones, as there are already many excellent tutorials on YouTube and I am not using any groundbreaking techniques. However, if there is interest in a skin tone video for me, please let me know. Anyway, here you can see the color palette I used for the skin tones. Now I'll show you briefly how I painted the helmets. I used colors from a special set from AK Interactive for German soldiers of the First World War. Although I don't think the set is ideal in all aspects, I used dark green-grey as the base color and Sahara yellow and saddle brown for the camouflage pattern fields. For each of these colors I also mixed a highlight color, which I applied in highly diluted form in the middle of the respective fields to give the fields more depth. I used the book by Opry as reference material. As the camouflage patterns were applied by hand back then, there are no fixed guidelines. I used the templates as a guide and then subdivided the color fields with fine black lines. In general, it should be noted that the color fields were only used at the very end of the war and are therefore suitable for depictions at the end of 1917 and 1918. After I had weathered the helmets by adding chips and enamel washes, the heads were finished. After I had glued the heads onto the bodies, the last two steps of the painting process followed. Firstly, I sealed the paint job with a coat of matte clear varnish. I then applied a targeted layer of semi-gloss clear varnish to certain areas such as the helmet, Sappen armor, shoes and leather reinforcements. This gave the helmet and armor a slightly metallic sheen and gave the impression of light moisture on the leather parts. The integration of the figures into the base and the final weathering will be covered in the next video, in which I'll show the painting of the base. Now it only remains for me to thank you for your interest and for watching this video. A big thank you goes out to my Patreon supporters who help me realize elaborate projects. My Patreon channel is primarily for support, but also offers special benefits such as 1 week early access to videos, name mentions and exclusive paid content. One example is my detailed PDF guide to painting German World War I soldiers, which details further painting steps. This guide is available in German and English and is free for Modellite Master subscribers or can also be purchased individually on my Patreon channel. Now I'll show you the finished figures on the base, which I will paint in the next video. As some of you already know from my last video, the presentation is again underlined by a vocal version of the Argonnerwald song, but in a different variation. The song is musically very appealing and historically of great interest, as it authentically reflects the mood of the soldiers at the front in 1914. It originated in the front ranks of the fighting troops. However, in the course of history it has often been altered and instrumentalized by various extremist groups, especially the Nazis. Even the original contains verses that have nationalistic and heroizing aspects.
Ein Pionier steht auf der Wacht, ein Sternlein hoch am Himmelsstand, bringt ihm ein Gruß aus fernem Heimatland. Ein Sternlein hoch am Himmelsstand, bringt ihm ein Gruß